Tonight, we're walking through the London of 1666 together. Not the polished stone city you know today, but a patchwork of timber houses where narrow lanes feel like tinder sticks ready to catch. You'll see how daily life, cooking bread, storing hemp by the docks, even repairing a cathedral, wove unnoticed danger into every corner. And then we'll watch what happens when a tiny spark finally tests that fragile balance. This is not just how the fire began, but why it changed the city forever. So get comfortable as we explore the causes and consequences of the Great Fire of London. Welcome back everyone, glad to see you again. If you enjoy these videos, be sure to leave a like, comment where you're tuning in from, and what your dream is in life. It really does help me. Now take a deep breath, relax, and enjoy this stroll through history. Imagine waking up in a wooden house where even the walls, the stairs, and the roof above your head could catch in an instant. Your entire street is made of the same thing, row upon row of timber frames stitched together with plaster, each one leaning into the next like they're whispering secrets over the narrow alleys. The smell of smoke drifts in from someone's cooking fire down the road, and you don't think twice about it because that's life in London. But in truth, the house you're standing in and the city outside your door are already laid out like kindling waiting for a spark. The houses loom in strange shapes, built upward as much as outward. The lower stories are narrow, but once you climb higher, each floor juts a little farther into the street. They call it jettying, and while it gave you more room on the upper floors, it also meant the second stories from both sides almost touched in the middle. Walk down these lanes at midday and it almost feels like dusk. Sunlight struggles to reach you between those wood-framed walls, and the wind cannot cut through. Everything feels cramped. Overcrowded streets, too many buildings stuffed too close together, and passageways narrower than a man's outstretched arms. A single ember here would touch not one house, but dozens at once. What makes it worse is that London wasn't a small town clinging to survival. By the 1660s, this was a city of merchants and money, bigger than most in Europe. Ships unloaded fine cloth and spices on the docks, gold and coin moved through Cheapside, and its markets teemed with life. But the larger London grew, the more fragile it became. Behind all the grandeur and trade, its core was a lattice of dried timber and tarred rooftops balanced above crowded streets. It was strength on the outside, weakness in the foundations, a city that seemed powerful, while secretly vulnerable to something as ordinary as fire. Here's the odd twist. No one really thought about the potential dangers of such urban planning. For centuries, this way of building made sense. Timber was cheap, easy to get, and quick to use. You could put up homes without needing a fortune. Thatch gave you solid roofing with little cost, and the jetty allowed more living space without paying for more land. Even the tight-packed streets meant you could cram as many shops and houses as possible inside the walls, which mattered when space was scarce. The layout blended economy with practicality, but it also meant an entire community could light up like a bundle of straw. Safety laws existed, at least in theory. Kings and city leaders had warned about fire before, even issued orders banning thatched roofs years earlier. But rules on paper and actions in practice aren't the same thing. Most people ignored regulations and officials looked the other way. By the 1660s, actual enforcement was faint at best. With trade booming and people pouring into the city, building fast and filling every inch was more important than worrying about what might happen later. So London continued to grow taller, closer and flimsier. The authorities may have hoped for safety, but they settled for speed and convenience instead. Now picture the streets themselves. You're walking down one of those alleys lined with houses on either side. The lane is so narrow you could stretch out your arms and almost touch both walls at once. If a fire did start, there was no room for escape, no space wide enough to tear down houses quickly to make a break. Streets that should have served as fire barriers instead acted as funnels, drawing flames deeper into the city. The very design of the roads made London an unstoppable maze once fire broke out. So you can see how it adds up. The walls were fuel, the roofs were kindling, the streets were tight tunnels, and the people in charge never managed to control any of it. Piece by piece, London had spent years building a trap for itself, a human-made snare no one recognised until it was already too late. Nobody needed an enemy, no army with torches, no great disaster engineered by nature. London's own choices, cheap homes, crowded streets, ignored safety laws, laid every stone in this trap. But the most unsettling part is this. It wasn't just the buildings. Life inside those buildings made the risks even greater. Every candle, every kitchen, every warehouse held a spark, and the dangers weren't hidden at all. They were normal. In fact, the very routines that kept the city alive also had the power to tip it over into disaster. Which raises the question, if the city itself was ready to burn, what daily activities made that danger almost unavoidable? Storing flour, bread or rope doesn't sound like a dangerous thing, but remember, this is 17th century London, a city with houses made of wood, roofs set with pitch, and walls already dried out like old kindling. When you put a bakery oven or piles of rope into that mix, you're basically building your life around a fuse and hoping no one lights it. You go about your morning chopping wood for the fire, and the very act of keeping yourself warm is another gamble. Take the bakeries, for example. Ovens burned hot long before sunrise when bread had to be ready for hungry crowds. The smell of smoke drifted through side streets every day, enough that it became background noise to life here. Sparks leapt from chimneys, coal spilled if fires weren't carefully stoked, and open ovens glowed red behind shop fronts. You tried not to think about how a single ember could jump onto beams dried from years of heat above them. Bakers weren't careless on purpose, but fire was constant. It wasn't unusual to see smoke rising from rooftops, not because of disaster, just because that was the smell of London waking up. Down by the river, the picture was no safer. The Thames waterfront groaned under the weight of tar barrels, hemp rope stacked in coils higher than your shoulders, and pitch stored in tubs beside timber cut for ship repair. Dock workers heard the creak of rope piles settling and thought nothing of it. The river air carried the stench of tar, sticky and strong enough to make the back of your throat burn. Rope strands frayed in your hand, leaving threads stuck to your skin, but it wasn't the roughness that mattered. It was that rope, once lit, burned like a torch and refused to go out. Yet London filled its wharves with enough of it to tether every ship from here to the Baltics. Inside homes you weren't much safer. Wooden staircases curled upward with candles illuminating each step. Chimneys cracked with age, smoke slipping through holes in brickwork and staining everything inside. If you leaned against the mantel, you left with soot on your arm. Light came from candles, and a candle knocked over after a long evening could bring down an entire household by morning. But these were not considered hazards, not really. They were simply part of living. Everyone needed to see at night, needed to cook, needed heat. Nobody labelled their daily routines as dangerous. The real irony lies here. Every act of survival added risk. You stored sacks of flour for bread making, piles of wood for burning, rope for your trade, tar for sealing boats, and candles for light. None of those things sound frightening on their own, yet stack them together in streets already built like firelighters, and suddenly everyday life sat on top of a thin crust of safety. Scratch it too hard and fire would burst from beneath. The Tower of London carried a darker secret still. Locked behind stone walls sat stockpiles of gunpowder, measured in tons, intended for the defence of the realm. Citizens walked past, never mentioning it aloud, but everyone understood. If a true blaze reached the tower, the explosion would not simply burn streets. It could scatter stones, cannon, and people across the city in an instant. That quiet knowledge simmered at the edges of thought, the unspoken fear they tried not to imagine. Londoners may have lived surrounded by danger, yet they shrugged it off. Foreign trade only increased it. Ships came with silk, flax, and oil, unloaded into warehouses stacked to rafters along narrow quaysides. Exotic woods, resins, and even sugar waited in storerooms, each more flammable than the last. Flames licking at a barrel shed by the docks could spread along the river, skip upward into jettied houses, and swallow rows of buildings before alarm rang out. Still, people celebrated trade. It was the proof of wealth, the sign that London thrived. With that wealth came danger disguised as prosperity. You can almost hear it. The constant scratching of rats in grain stores, the groan of timber beams in crowded warehouses, the footsteps of porters dragging loads across wooden floors. Mixed with those sounds is the hiss of tar bubbling in barrels, and the rush of wind carrying sparks from chimneys straight down alleys too cramped to let them vanish. Life carried on as if nothing was waiting to happen. It was normal. That's the terrifying truth. Londoners normalised living inside a powder keg. Think about walking through it yourself. You turn a corner, see women carrying water pails past rope coils stacked under an open window. Children run door to door with candles lit to guide them in the haze of dawn. A baker's boy cleans ash from last night's oven, smudging soot across his cheek while sparks rise behind him. On the next street, a tavern owner hauls barrels up crumbling steps, dripping ale across floors layered in rushes. Nobody looks panicked. This is simply London on an ordinary day, blind to how close each act comes to disaster. It's not just about one careless worker or one loose spark. It's about a whole city shaped by what it needed to live. They had to cook bread, keep ships ready, mend sails, trade goods, light their homes, and warm themselves against damp English nights. But those same actions created an endless circle of sparks and fuel. In a world built of timber and tar, safety wasn't just fragile, it was almost impossible. And here lies the twist. Out of these thousands of risky moments, only one had to go wrong. One bakery, one oven left untended, one ember slipping into the wrong beam. That single misstep would be enough to tip the balance from ordinary London life into unstoppable catastrophe. And when it finally happened, it all began on an ordinary Sunday morning in a small bakery on Pudding Lane. It began with bread, in the quiet hours of Sunday, September the 2nd, 1666. The air was still, a faint mist hanging over the city, and most of London was asleep. In a small bakery on Pudding Lane, ovens had been burning since the night before, heating loaves for early morning buyers. The baker, Thomas Farriner, had closed up, certain the flames were secure. But in a house made of timber, with floors dry enough to catch from the smallest ember, certainty was an illusion. A spark slipped out, crept into the beams, and began to glow behind the walls where no one was watching. You can almost see the scene. The street outside is so narrow you could reach across to shake your neighbour's hand from an upstairs window. Above you, roofs overlap like shingles, many of them tarred or pitched for extra protection against rain, protection that now doubled as fuel. Down the lane, a horse shifts in its stall, hooves scuffing against wood, but in that bakery, hidden behind shutters, a fire that should have been sleeping in its oven starts to spread into the house itself. The warmth that was meant to feed the neighbourhood now crawls outward with a new hunger. At first the danger looked small. A flicker appeared against the darkness, no different from a candle flame seen through a gap. A passer-by might have noticed smoke curling upward, though nothing out of the ordinary for a city breathing fire from thousands of chimneys every day. Night watchmen were used to black plumes rising into the sky. It rarely spelled danger. People turned back to their beds, shrugging off the glow in the distance. The city was too familiar with smoke to imagine what was about to follow. Word reached the authorities not long after dawn, but this is where arrogance became as dangerous as fire. When the Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, finally arrived, he was unimpressed. Looking at the flames licking the houses, he dismissed it with words that carried more weight than he realised. He said it could be pissed out. Think about that. While homes crackled on Pudding Lane, the highest official in the city brushed them aside as if a few buckets of water from the nearest well could end it all. That single moment of underestimation set the tone for the hours to come. The fire crept forward, pivoting from one home to another as if the narrow street were built for it. Neighbours began shouting, dragging belongings into the road, but most believed official orders would arrive soon to cut the flames off. And there was a known method: demolishing houses. If you tore down a few buildings, you could starve a fire before it crossed. But here's the problem. Who was willing to destroy property on nothing more than a possibility? Demolishing meant wrecking valuable homes, valuable shops, valuable stock, and if you guessed wrong, you'd have ruined people's lives for nothing. The hesitation brought the fire exactly what it needed. More wood, more tar, and more streets boxed in tight, ready to light. Those early hours could have been decisive. The fire still clung to Pudding Lane and its immediate neighbours. With enough force, enough boldness, the perimeter could have gone down fast and the flames contained. But instead of action, the minutes drained away. The ovens kept flaming, the beams kept snapping under heat, and smoke thickened until the glow turned into a roar. By the time water buckets came, the fire was already climbing higher than nearby rooftops. Neighbours who thought they had time watched smoke pour into the second floors of houses, spreading across to the next street before their very eyes. By morning, shops were already collapsing, beams snapping and raining sparks over bystanders. The fire stopped being a matter of should we demolish and became how do we even approach it? But now it was too late. The kindling that was London itself had been lit. People who tried to douse flames with leather buckets found their water turn to steam before it touched the blaze. Sparks leapt from roof to roof faster than water could be carried from wells. Within a few hours of that first forgotten ember, a local kitchen incident had transformed into something beyond anyone's command. What's striking is not only the spark itself, but the blindness in response. One official's words, a delay in decision, and the refusal to sacrifice property in the name of safety gave the fire its chance. The city's early inaction was not neutral. It was fuel, just like the wood and tar stacked inside every home. The fire gained strength not simply from beams and roofs, but from hesitation. By midday, you could see entire streets in Pudding Lane burning together, No single house left to separate flame from flame. The trap the city had built for itself had just snapped shut. Picture again that quiet Sunday. While you might still have been resting, convinced by the calm outside, London was losing control under your feet. A bakery oven had lit a problem bigger than the men who tried to command it. As families carried goods through smoke-choked lanes, the danger was no longer contained to one neighbourhood. It was crawling into the heart of the city. By evening, the scale of disaster had grown beyond a mayor's arrogance, beyond a baker's mistake, beyond the first bucket of water tossed at a wall. By the time Monday arrived, there was nothing small about it. The fire was no flicker in a bakery or even a single lane glowing in the dark. It was moving, surging into new districts, and challenging the very idea of whether London could be controlled at all. The spark from Pudding Lane had become the storm, and the city was about to see what happens when a fire spreads faster than people can even think. By Monday morning, the fire wasn't just spreading. It was moving faster than the city could even process. You wake up expecting another day, but instead, you're staring at a skyline that already looks cruelly unfamiliar. The smoke isn't drifting lazily anymore. It's thick, rolling in waves, pushed by strong winds that turn every flicker into a wall of flame. These weren't gentle breezes. They were forceful gusts that carried sparks across streets like a hand scattering seeds. And when sparks took hold here, they didn't just light a corner. They swallowed houses whole, one after another, until entire rows disappeared behind the blaze. At first, people thought they could control it with the usual methods. Buckets filled in the wells, lines of men passing water hand to hand, the squirt pumps rattling as they forced weak jets into curling flames. But the truth was obvious within minutes. It wasn't enough. The buckets steamed and hissed as the water evaporated before even touching wood. The leather squirts never reached the flames high above in the attics, and the pumps collapsed under the pressure or simply ran out of stored water. You watched men sweat, muscles straining, only for fires to leap past them without hesitation. What had once contained hearth fires in single homes was laughably weak against a raging inferno driven by wind. They might as well have been spitting at it. Citizens had no choice but to pick between fighting and fleeing. Unsurprisingly, most did what humans naturally do. They tried to protect what was theirs. Imagine your neighbour piling chests of clothing into a cart, dragging them into the smoky street, while another loads pewter dishes, books and bedding onto wheelbarrows. Instead of forming a chain to pass water, they were scrambling to rescue their entire lives. Family silver clattered onto cobblestones, wardrobes toppled, whole beds were hauled into alleys where fire raced only a few doors away. It looked more like a desperate moving day than a firefight, but to them, possessions meant survival. Not everyone trusted that London would outlive the fire, so if their house burned, carrying belongings might be their only insurance. The contradiction was almost painful. While talk spread about creating fire breaks, pulling down homes before the blaze reached them, very little was done. The orders hesitated in the air, bouncing between the mayor, the council, and those forced to enforce them. Nobody wanted to bear the blame for destroying valuable property. The result? While debates lingered, the flames devoured whole blocks. By the time decision became action, houses were already collapsing. Bricks and beams fell in showers of sparks. Smoke blocked sunlight until the day looked like endless dusk. With every delay, London gave away another piece of itself. Then came the poison of rumour. Crowds whispered about foreign agents, about Dutch or French men seen lurking with firebrands in their hands. England was at war with both nations at the time, and suspicion thrived in panic. You'd hear shouts that a stranger had been caught setting fire to a wall, only to see moments later a mob gather and drag someone through the street. Citizens turned on outsiders rather than the flames, clubbing them or locking them up, convinced the fire itself wasn't bad enough to have been started by chance. Hatred, not firefighting, absorbed much of the city's energy. It's hard to say what destroyed more, flames or the fear of enemies within. This chaos only worsened the scale of destruction. While men chased suspect foreigners, roofs collapsed, streets filled with embers bright enough to land in the hair of children trying to flee. Even the passages meant to be safe became traps. Cheapside, the vital commercial street, was consumed until shops, warehouses and jewellers all fell into heaps of ash. The gates, which once felt like security from invaders, now funneled smoke and heat, narrowing escape routes and choking anyone trying to pass through. Panic carried crowds toward exits. You could hear the screams as thousands pressed together, knocking over carts, trampling belongings left behind by others too weak to carry them farther. By midday Monday, it was clear London had lost control. The flames weren't creeping anymore. They ran, faster than horses in some lanes, driven by winds roaring like bellows. Towers stood glowing red before melting into rubble. People clutched their children, wading through blackened air, while others stood dazed, staring at what had been homes just the day before. The sound was steady. Glass exploding, beams collapsing, the wail of voices as fire spread. No chain of buckets, no plan of fire breaks, no mayor's words could slow it now. You realized then, standing among thousands of others, that this was no ordinary blaze. London wasn't just fighting fire. It was being consumed by something beyond human control. By nightfall, the city knew the truth. Whatever hope they had when dawn broke was gone. What began in Pudding Lane was now devouring the heart of the city itself. That second day marked the moment fear turned to absolute despair. Sunday had been a start, a warning still possible to contain. Monday stripped away the illusion of control. The flames swept through Cheapside, across gates, chasing families into the open fields outside the walls. Men wept openly. Women clutched bundles of cloth and food tied together with rope, though many knew there was nowhere safe left to put them. Whole groups camped in open spaces, watching the glow rise over rooftops like a cruel sunset that never ended. Children cried themselves to sleep in smoke-choked fields while fire chewed at the districts behind them. And all the while wind carried sparks further into the city, building the storm higher. By the end of that Monday, London wasn't watching a fire. London was running from a monster. One that ate faster than thought, one that punished hesitation, one born from arrogance and fueled by chaos. And worse still, this was only the beginning. Because when Tuesday dawned, the question was no longer about stopping it. It was about survival, and how much of their city might even remain standing by the time the flames began to slow. By Tuesday, the question was not if London would burn, but how much of it could actually survive. You wake to the smell of smoke so thick it cuts into your throat and eyes before you even leave the bed. Across the rooftops, the glow is no longer distant. It is everywhere, surrounding the city like a furnace. People gathering water or fleeing with carts had already lost their sense of where the fire came from, because it seemed to come from every street at once. The wind still carried sparks, but now entire planks of wood and burning thatch sailed through the sky, landing on buildings half a mile away. For the first time, everyone understood that the fire would not stop on its own. The danger was no longer just homes and shops going up in flames. The fire had moved close to the Tower of London, and inside those stone walls sat barrels upon barrels of gunpowder. The very idea hung over the city like a shadow. If fire touched the tower, the gunpowder would ignite, and the blast would rip through everything. Soldiers stationed there knew it was not a question of losing houses. It was a question of losing half the city in one ignition. Families whispered about it as they carried bedding or food into nearby fields. The flames chasing them were one horror, but the thought of an explosion that could rip the skies apart was worse. Each shift of the wind shoved the fire toward that threat, and the whole city held its breath waiting to see if it would happen. It was in this climate of dread that officials made a decision few were willing to speak of openly at first. Fire breaks had to be made, but the flames were already past the point of using buckets, hooks, and half-hearted demolitions. The only tool with enough force left in the city was the very thing people feared: gunpowder. Soldiers and citizens alike began to place charges not near the tower, but in houses standing directly in the path of the fire. Homes that were perfectly intact were blown sky high in an attempt to stop the fire from consuming even more. Imagine standing in the street, watching your neighbour's walls crash inward, not from the fire itself, but from explosives laid by your own countrymen. Bricks flew, timbers snapped, and roofs collapsed, leaving jagged gaps in rows of houses. You might think the destruction would have been terrifying enough, but the fire treated those explosions almost as a challenge. Flames licked across the empty gaps, rushing forward regardless, and yet it helped. Slowly, as more houses fell to charges, fire breaks widened. The losses were vast, but without them the entire city may have gone the way of Pudding Lane. Meanwhile, the riverfront looked like a war zone. Warehouses filled with oil and tar hissed in plumes of black smoke as they collapsed. Flames painted grotesque patterns across the river's surface, where patches of floating timber still smouldered as the tide pushed them along. Ships pulled out, laden with families clutching trunks, mattresses, even furniture piled so high masts could barely be seen. The Thames itself was choked with boats, not only carrying people but animals, carts, and goods, all carried away from the inferno creeping closer. Above all of it loomed St. Paul's Cathedral. Covered in wooden scaffolding from an ongoing restoration, it had stood against earlier city fires. Citizens looked to it as a solid landmark, a symbol of endurance that would hold while streets all around it were consumed. But by Tuesday, that belief collapsed along with its walls. Fire licked through the scaffolding first, turning the wood into a ladder guiding flames up the great stone shell. Soon the roof collapsed, the lead pouring in rivers over cobblestones, carrying liquid metal through the lanes like streams of fire. The heat was so violent that stones themselves seemed to explode outward, raining fragments like grenades into the surrounding streets. Those watching from safer ground saw the landmark vanish, not in a single roar, but in a grinding collapse, section by section, until the place that had stood over London for centuries was gone. One eyewitness, John Evelyn, recorded watching the stones hurled outward by the force of the heat, comparing it to grenades. For those on the ground, there wasn't much difference. The sound was deafening, a mixture of detonations from collapsing walls and screams from people scrambling in terror. Families who had clutched to hope that St. Paul's might anchor them saw the opposite. It had joined the fire as fuel, and its ruin only drove people further into despair. Even as these landmarks fell, the plan with gunpowder began to make a difference. Recent blasts tore wide enough gaps that flames finally struggled to leap across. The walls of smoke that had eaten the city from every side began to lose cohesion. Fires still roared in districts, but they no longer looked unbroken. By the end of Tuesday, London was scarred deeper than anyone imagined possible. But a sliver of hope returned. Explosions that once threatened to destroy the city had, ironically, saved parts of it. Entire neighbourhoods had been sacrificed so that the rest of London might stand. The cost was almost impossible to measure. Whole parishes no longer existed. Streets that once bustled with markets were blackened husks, their stones cracked by heat. Families camped outside the city now watched the skyline without its cathedral, without the shops and walls they'd called home. Yet the fire had finally begun to yield ground. Not to water, not to leather buckets, but to force and sacrifice. By Tuesday night, Londoners no longer measured the fire by how far it would spread, but by what was left to save. Children asked where they would sleep. Mothers looked back towards smoke still rising behind them. And standing at the edge of the fields, you saw thousands of eyes turn toward the glow, watching the last of their city fight against flames. From this point forward, the story of the fire was no longer written in entire streets, but in the lives of people who carried what little they could away from the ruin. And to understand what those hours felt like, we have to see through their eyes. What did it look and sound like to watch your city unravel before your eyes? You stand among thousands of people, every face lit red from flames bouncing off walls, and for a moment you wonder if you're dreaming. Smoke stings your eyes, and the air feels thick, heavy enough that every breath hurts. The noise is the strangest thing, sometimes a roaring louder than anything you've heard, and sometimes silence. People watch in disbelief, frozen, unable to accept what's happening, until some snap out of it and rush screaming through the streets. You don't have the luxury of disbelief. The fire is right there, eating away everything in front of you. From the Tower of London, Samuel Pepys observed it all. He wrote about what he saw across the water. Whole streets burning, people abandoning their homes while carrying possessions on their backs, and the tide of smoke covering the skies. He knew this wasn't just houses going up. It was wealth, food, and markets being destroyed at once. He saw fear spreading as quickly as the fire itself. You can imagine him leaning out across the walls of the tower, watching not just the destruction, but the collapse of ordinary life. When the shops and granaries went under, people realized it wasn't only their roofs in danger, but their future, their supplies, their plans for tomorrow. Fear soaked into the crowd faster than smoke penetrated clothing. John Evelyn recorded his own view. He described St. Paul's Cathedral collapsing under the weight of flames, stones blasting outward as if they were weapons. To him, the sight resembled grenades flying through the air, shards of ancient masonry turned into missiles hurled across the city by the heat itself. If you were anywhere close, it didn't matter if you had fled the fire, it hurled the city at you anyway. Imagine hearing that crack and feeling the ground shudder, and knowing the place you thought unshakable was shattered in minutes. A building people always thought they could rely on was torn apart like it was nothing more than straw. What did it look and sound like to watch your city unravel before your eyes? You stand among thousands of people, every face lit red from flames bouncing off walls, and for a moment you wonder if you're dreaming. Smoke stings your eyes, and the air feels thick, heavy enough that every breath hurts. The noise is the strangest thing, sometimes a roaring louder than anything you've heard, and sometimes silence. People watch in disbelief, frozen, unable to accept what's happening, until some snap out of it and rush screaming through the streets. You don't have the luxury of disbelief. The fire is right there, eating away everything in front of you. From the Tower of London, Samuel Pepys observed it all. He wrote about what he saw across the water, whole streets burning, people abandoning their homes while carrying possessions on their backs, and the tide of smoke covering the skies. He knew this wasn't just houses going up. It was wealth, food, and markets being destroyed at once. He saw fear spreading as quickly as the fire itself. You can imagine him leaning out across the walls of the tower, watching not just the destruction, but the collapse of ordinary life. When the shops and granaries went under, people realized it wasn't only their roofs in danger, but their future, their supplies, their plans for tomorrow. Fear soaked into the crowd faster than smoke penetrated clothing. John Evelyn recorded his own view. He described St. Paul's Cathedral collapsing under the weight of flames, stones blasting outward as if they were weapons. To him, the sight resembled grenades flying through the air, shards of ancient masonry turned into missiles hurled across the city by the heat itself. If you were anywhere close, it didn't matter if you'd fled the fire, it hurled the city at you anyway. Imagine hearing that crack and boom, feeling the ground shudder, and knowing the place you thought unshakable was shattered in minutes. A building people always thought they could rely on was torn apart like it was nothing more than straw. Those were the voices of the men who wrote things down, but among the crowd there were smaller stories, the unrecorded voices that never made it onto parchment. Families dragged their bedding and trunks onto small riverboats, children crouched inside piles of cloth, mothers shouting to make sure the tide didn't swallow their things. The river became a highway of escape. Some boats carried animals, chickens tied in baskets, dogs barking as they were pushed aboard, cows mooing from rafts. Strangers who had no reason to help each other before now joined together, shoving carts side by side, carrying buckets to share, steadying one another as smoke pressed down. In a city where competition and trade usually ruled, fear made people work hand in hand in ways they might never have imagined on a normal day. Walk down one street and you could witness quiet disbelief. Groups of neighbours staring at a burning house without sound, just watching it crumble. Walk to the next and panic took over. Screams filling the air, people grabbing whatever they could hold, shouting at soldiers, accusing strangers, fighting for space on the roads leading out. The city had become a patchwork of moods. Silence and shock on one side, chaos and mob anger on the other. You'd see people dragging furniture into open ground while, just a few steps away, others beat a supposed foreign arsonist, convinced they had caught the culprit. Then there's the physical toll. Tens of thousands were pushed out of their homes with nothing but what their arms could carry. Huge numbers of Londoners were left outside the city walls, sleeping under open sky. It was September, the nights were cold and damp, and mattresses laid out in fields soaked through with dew. Some had food stashed from their shops, but many had nothing more than what they could hold in a single bundle. Watching entire families huddle in the dark, children crying, fires burning behind them, you'd see how disaster tears away not just structures but dignity. No plan existed for what to do with that many displaced people. London went from being a packed, vibrant city to a refugee camp almost overnight. What Pepys saw from the tower wasn't just fire moving across districts. He was watching people in shock, dragging goods into the water, begging for food, and losing their sense of order. His diary noted how the fire consumed treasure as well as timber, and how a mood of ruin blanketed the crowds. That's the lesson in his writing. You can see not just flames, but the way fear and hopelessness spread across the city like smoke. Evelyn added his own truth, of buildings exploding into projectiles, a city literally throwing its stones at those who had once lived inside it. And together, they give us a vision not only of falling walls and burning roofs, but of fear, resilience, anger, and despair living side by side in the same streets. Now imagine standing in those fields outside, your family huddled next to you, your belongings a pile that feels absurdly small. Behind you, the city still burns, glowing an angry orange in the dark. Ahead of you is nothing certain. No roof, no idea where you'll sleep tomorrow, no clear plan about whether London has a future at all. That image lingers at every account. Not just the fire itself, but the human faces pressed into every corner of it, some standing silent, others screaming themselves hoarse. And with that, the question starts pressing at you. Once the flames finally stopped moving, what exactly was left of London, and could it ever be put back together? When the final embers cooled, London faced a different kind of fire. Not one of smoke and sparks, but one of survival. How to rebuild a city that had collapsed into ash. The sight was staggering. Streets that once pulsed with noise were nothing more than blackened pathways lined with rubble. Outlines of foundations marked where houses had stood, and scorched walls pointed upward like broken teeth. For those returning to the heart of the city, the silence was worse than the flames. It wasn't a raging inferno anymore, it was absence. Everything familiar had been scraped away in a matter of days. The numbers give shape to just how brutal the fire had been. Roughly 87 churches were gone. More than 400 streets erased. About 13,000 houses were destroyed, amounting to most of the homes within the walls. Markets that had buzzed with traders were levelled. Even important livery halls, the headquarters of the city's trades and guilds, were piles of char. These weren't simply buildings. They were the backbone of a society where business, livelihood and identity were tied directly to place. Imagine that as you try to return home after the fire. It isn't there. Your work isn't there. Your parish isn't there. Everything is ash. Now, officials claim the number of deaths was surprisingly low. A handful of recognised casualties officially written down. But think about that claim. In a city where entire districts vanished, do we really believe only a few lives were lost? The poor, the elderly, those without family to vouch for them, they weren't counted. Records meant little if no one survived to record them, and nobody kept statistics on the nameless who couldn't flee in time. So while the official count painted a strangely fortunate picture, the truth likely hid dozens, maybe hundreds. Lives disappeared unacknowledged in the same way their houses had. For the living, the suffering didn't stop when flames receded. Tens of thousands had no homes left at all. Families surged into open fields outside the walls. Try to picture it. A countryside turned into sprawling camps, bedding laid out under damp skies, food supplies dwindling with no ovens or markets to replace them. These weren't organised shelters. People simply clung where they could, waiting for some relief to materialise. Within days, makeshift markets popped up on the city's edge, selling food, tools, even stolen goods, which of course sparked fights and arguments. Life outside became as desperate as the scenes of fire had been just nights earlier. Survival shifted from fleeing flames to scratching out food, warmth, and safety under open air. And then came the fury. People looked for someone to blame, and the easiest target was authority. The Lord Mayor, Thomas Bloodworth, became a symbol of incompetence. His casual dismissal early in the fire was remembered bitterly. Citizens spat his name with anger, calling him out for failing to act, failing to order demolition soon enough, failing to understand what was at stake. Along with him came new waves of suspicion. Many still believed foreigners or Catholics had set the blaze, so fear warped into hostility once more. People shouted accusations against strangers in the street, fights broke out, and rumour moved faster than any attempt at measured truth. What's curious is how the monarchy stepped into the vacuum. Charles II and his brother James, Duke of York, didn't just sit idly in palaces, they entered the city. The king himself ordered food sent to the camps outside and took visible steps to relieve suffering. James, meanwhile, directed soldiers during the firefighting and later took part in organising the clean-up. That didn't erase the chaos or the anger, but it showed Londoners a royal family willing to step into the smoke. For some, it softened resentment toward the crown at a time when the city needed someone, anyone, to appear in control. Walking through the remains of London in those days would have been surreal. On one corner, blackened beams stuck out of ash. On another, people clustered around makeshift stalls buying scraps to get through another night. Refugees huddled among carts filled with belongings, children curled on bedding, while priests attempted to hold services in fields for parishes that no longer had churches. Whispers of plot still rippled through families sitting round campfires, wondering if this disaster was natural or man-made. At the same time, merchants paced angrily, already counting the costs of rebuilding shops, calculating debts they couldn't pay, and demanding that order return. But even amid despair, there were signs of determination. Londoners were not accustomed to standing still. Slowly, plans began forming in the ashes. Structures of temporary wood sprung up at the edges of ruins so that business could restart. Markets, makeshift as they were, spread along perimeters to give displaced people something to rely on. The energy of the city flickered weakly, but it still existed. That resilience mattered, even if it staggered against the weight of loss. Yet no one could ignore how broken society felt. The city's skeleton, its buildings, streets and parishes, was gone. Its flesh, the people, were scattered and sleeping under open sky. The distrust, the anger, the hunger, all combined to create a city that hadn't simply lost buildings but had lost the glue that held it together. Some wanted to point fingers, others wanted quick reconstruction, while many only wanted enough food and warmth to last until morning. Physically and socially, London was as much in ruins as the stones of St. Paul's, and it was out of this ruin that a new question emerged. What should a rebuilt London look like? Would it be the same city of timber lanes and haphazard growth, or something stronger, safer, less fragile? The fire had ripped apart what existed. Out of those ashes, London had to choose what it would become, and the answer would shape its streets, its laws, and its identity for centuries to come. Because in the aftermath, something larger stirred. Practicality, vision, and argument began to collide. Not whether London would rebuild, but how. And that is where the story turns, not from fire and ruin, but toward ideas of order and protection, toward brick and stone, toward the dream of a fireproof city. Out of the ashes, London decided it would never burn the same way again. You can almost imagine standing there, boots crunching on blackened rubble, and hearing the sound of hammers instead of falling beams. The fire had left a blank canvas, and people in power were determined not to rebuild the old fragile tinderbox. This was a chance to rethink how a city should look, not just how it should function. And while the memories of tents, fields full of refugees and smouldering ruins were still fresh, new regulations came down in a way London hadn't seen before. The first step came in the Rebuilding Act of 1667. It sounds dry now, but at the time it was like someone had set a rulebook in stone. No more timber across whole districts, no more slapped-together wooden sheds that pretended to be permanent houses. Instead, the order was clear: brick and stone only, stronger, heavier, slower to build, but also less likely to send half a parish up in smoke when a single chimney went wrong. For families who had lived in cramped, tilted houses with beams blackened by smoke, this was a shift into a different world. You weren't just building shelter. You were building something meant to last beyond your own lifetime. Of course, not everyone agreed on how the city should be rebuilt. Visionaries like Christopher Wren and Robert Hooke stepped forward with plans that looked more like grand designs for a kingdom than an everyday city. Wren sketched neat grids, wide boulevards, and open squares. It would have looked more like Paris than the tangled streets people remembered. Hooke's version wasn't far off, but ideas on paper and reality on the ground rarely match. London was not an empty wasteland. It was plots of land owned by hundreds of landlords, merchants and tenants, all of them arguing about where their boundaries lay. Grand plans required tearing up old property lines. That meant long disputes, endless lawsuits, and an amount of money nobody really had. People needed roofs now, not visions of perfect cities later. So most of the grand schemes were politely set aside. Practicality won the argument before debate really got going. That doesn't mean nothing changed. In fact, the fire carved in some remarkable differences. Streets were widened so carts and pedestrians no longer had to squeeze shoulders to shoulder. Houses were regulated so no single home leaned dangerously toward another. Building heights were restricted, and architects had to follow uniform guidelines. Fire safety rules that had once been ignored became law with teeth this time. You could walk through the newer streets later in the century and instantly see the difference. Not a crooked timber sprawl anymore, but straighter roads, cleaner lines, and rows of sturdier houses that showed London had learned its lesson the hard way. But even strict laws can be strangled by quarrels, especially property fights. Landlords and tenants argued constantly over who paid for what. Repairs, costs of rebuilding, the very shape of ownership, all stopped progress over and over again. To fix this, fire courts were created, special legal bodies that sped through disputes. Instead of dragging out lawsuits for decades, decisions were made quickly so rebuilding could move forward. You didn't have to like the ruling, but at least it settled things. Think about it. A whole section of law made for one disaster, pushing arguments aside in the name of not keeping the city in limbo. It was messy, but it worked. Then there was the cultural impact, which was just as important as the bricks and mortar. Before 1666, nobody thought much about fire insurance. Why insure something everyone assumed would stay standing? After the fire, insurance became not only possible but essential. New companies sprouted offering protection, and surprisingly, it wasn't just about paperwork. Many insurers set up their own private fire brigades because it was in their interest to keep your house from burning down in the first place. Imagine it. Rival brigades rushing to a fire, pulling water pumps, scrambling to prove their worth, not always for charity, but because if your property survived, their payout stayed low. It turned firefighting into a business. but also created the seed of organised protection the city had never truly had before. Some of the changes were symbolic, but symbols matter. Take the monument, designed by Wren and Hook. On the surface, it was a memorial, a giant stone column rising above the rebuilt streets, marking the loss and remembering the destruction. But it was more than that. It also functioned as a kind of scientific tool, a place for experiments with light and measurement. In that single column, you had a structure that carried memory, grief, ambition, and curiosity. It still stands now, a reminder not just of what London lost, but of what it reshaped into. And then, of course, there was St. Paul's Cathedral. The fire had torn through the old medieval structure as if it were paper. In rebuilding it, Wren designed something entirely new, something monumental. Its great dome wasn't just a replacement, but a reimagining of what London's skyline should be. Other churches followed with simpler but still elegant versions of his designs, each one using stone and symmetry rather than vulnerable wood and haphazard lines. You can trace the London we know today, its balance of grandeur and resilience, back to these post-fire decisions. Without that catastrophe, the skyline might look far more medieval even in the modern day, so by the time rebuilding settled into steady rhythm, London had done more than put its streets back. It had created new rules, stronger foundations, faster conflict resolution, and an industry in fire safety that spread far beyond its borders. The city shed some of its fragility, though at a cruel cost. What burned in 1666 set the conditions for how modern cities would think about risk and design. London wrote its lessons into stone, which leads to the bigger question. If London was reshaped by a single spark revealing its weaknesses, what about the cities we live in today? What hidden flaws wait to be exposed when the smallest accident finally puts them to the test? The Great Fire proved how a single spark can pull apart more than houses. It exposed flaws in planning, in leadership, and in the way people accepted danger as normal. What looked safe enough one day turned into ashes the next. Out of that came a city reshaped, one that finally guarded itself with stone, rules, and insurance instead of hope. But disasters don't only belong to the past. Every city today has its quiet weaknesses too, tucked behind walls and routines we barely notice. The question is simple. What tiny spark would be enough to reveal them now? Thank you so much for listening, everyone. I hope you enjoyed this stroll through history. Remember to subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. I bid you farewell and wish you a pleasant trip to Dreamland.